Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to Consumer Identity World 2017, here at Paris event. We already have one in Seattle, we will have one in Singapore in December. Welcome to this joint event of CXP Group and KuppingerCole. We run together and we created together. I just want to quickly, before we start, introduce the moderators of today, which are Laurent Charéran, who's CXP Group. He will moderate one of the tracks today. John Talbot also will moderate one of the tracks, and John also will moderate the evening keynote session. And me, Martin Kuppinger, I will moderate the morning session, and together with John I'll do the first keynote. There will be snacks and drinks reception today after the evening keynotes, which is hosted by Facebook. So I just want to inform you about that, so don't miss it. And with that, given that we have a short time for each of the keynotes, we directly will start with our first keynote, then done by John and me, which is balancing user experience, privacy and security for the connected customer segment. So, as I've said, it's one we will do together, John and me. And I think it's very obvious in these days where we discuss a lot about GDPR, not only in the EU, but I would say across the world. There's a situation where we have to discuss about privacy. So GDPR heavily brings in this privacy aspect. We have to discuss about security anyway. So when we look at all the hacks, all the data getting lost, etc. So we had so many prominent hacks over the past years of where millions, tens of millions of customer records have been hacked. On the other hand, we have the user experience side of things. So how can we make it convenient for the customer, the consumer, to work? And so that I would say rather complex trilemma, I would say, and we have to figure out ways how to do it good. And when we look at the consumer perspective on that, so user experience, privacy, security, then user experience from a customer or consumer perspective means everything should be super simple to use. I don't want to register again and again and again, so registration really is a boring thing. And I want to authenticate the way I want to. What is convenient to me? I want to use the most convenient method here. For privacy, most will probably say I will tell you everything for a price, but only to my advantage. So it's a little bit a strange situation. So on one hand, people are, as we all know, willing to tell a lot of stuff if they feel they got something back. But they anyway complain about if they feel it's not used the right way. But what GDPR will bring in, I think this is an interesting aspect, and I think we already started learning it when you look at what the Microsoft Edge browser, or recently I had it when I tried to use Google Maps. Then you end up being asked or informed, oh, we collect a lot of data and you have to look at this and blah, 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 privacy policy, or we using cookies, and then you can look up the things, and then you end up with a lot of information you've never saw before about what is collected and where it is sent, etc. And I think I didn't know about what you collected that will change latest with GDPR. It already starts to change. And that, when you look at the lists, you sometimes feel scared a little and say, okay, that much? So security, again, security must be simple to use. Oh, and no one really likes passwords. And anyway, the perception of the consumer always is, if something goes wrong, it's not a consumer who is guilty. It's the business which is guilty. When I look at it from an enterprise perspective, it's sort of the total opposite. So user experience, there are usually some budget constraints, also when it comes to UI modernization. Then we look at compliance of an onboarding and other processes, so you have to agree to the terms and conditions, which are several hundred pages long, sometimes even longer. Oh yes, and businesses are so creative these days. So every single department creates its highly innovative apps and applications and new services. Unfortunately, usually they don't talk with each other. So everyone is some way innovative, but there's, and even in very large organizations, in many organizations, there's a gap of coordinating these efforts. So all these apps look a little different. All these apps, they even might come up with different registrations, etc. Privacy, yeah, everyone feels that personally identifiable information is the new money. So they want to earn it. They even try to harvest it when they have no clue about what to do with that information. So when we look at what information is collected, a lot of information is collected which isn't used. There was never a thought about minimizing the PII collected. And yes, there are so many different regulations anyway around privacy. It's not only GDPR. So there are in various regions and countries different regulations, but there's more than GDPR. Even in the EU, which you have to look at. And so it's a complex thing. Security, what people have learned is security issues can cost their jobs. So if you lose some millions of your customer records and you're the CISO, you most likely will have an issue. Because these things gain the attention of the CEO today. And it will become even worse when you look at the breach notifications in the context of GDPR. We will learn far more about it. That might also make things better, you know. At the end, if we have so many incidents which become public, people will care less about a single incident, unless you're very prominent. So if you're not that prominent, no one will care about you, maybe. Wait and see what happens. Security costs so much money. That's also a perspective of the enterprise. So I have to pay for it. And everything is too complex, yes, because everyone creates its own apps and applications, and I have all this old stuff, and oh yes, I still have a mainframe where my life insurance core runs on, and how can I protect this complex ecosystem? So it's a complicated situation, and the one thing we will have to add to this is consent. So we will, and I don't go too much into detail here, I think you have heard about this a lot. We have consent as a new topic, and consent in fact means with GDPR we have many situations where we have to ask for consent that is given explicitly, that is given informed, and so on. So you have gone through all that, clear and plain language, etc. And so it means we have to inform about which PII we collect for which purpose. By the way, the legitimate interest, which is brought up sometimes as, oh, we don't need explicit consent because we have a legitimate interest in collecting the data, isn't really the way out of that. Because you still have to inform about a lot of stuff. And if you, for instance, collect stuff from children and so below 18-year-old people, then you have to do it in a language which is adapted to these. So there are so many things around that that we just should assume that we have to inform everyone explicitly about what we do with, and what we collect and what we do with it. And that will lead to a situation where people understand far better what is collected. And that really is a big change for this entire balance between privacy and, on the other hand, the user experience. So a lot of things will change here. And with that, I hand over to John for the next part.
Thank you. So yeah, going a little bit into the consent picture, you know, we really need, as proprietors of consumer identity systems, you need to clearly state what it is you want to do with customer data and why. And like Martin said, it's more than just having a legitimate interest. You've got to have a real reason for wanting to process that information other than just collecting as much as you possibly can. And that's kind of been the default up to this point, is just suck up every little bit of data you possibly can about the consumer in the hope that you might be able to make some money off of it. So you really need to let the consumer know, well, what do I get out of it? And this will probably lead to entirely new business models or the expansion of business models like freemium. So you have a product that you might allow people to use a minimal feature set for a while, and then if they want to get more advanced functionality, then it's a pay-as-you-go type of service. And then finding ways to do revenue sharing. I mean, I think if you look at some of the interesting things even going on around cryptocurrency and consumer identity, there will probably be ways to pass along revenue sharing directly back to the consumer. So over and above just providing them with a discount for a service, perhaps. And really this gets to needing to provide some sort of reward to the user for giving them giving you their permission to use their data. So we talk about friction and frictionless user experiences. Really, the less data you collect, the lower the friction, regardless of what the scenario is. And on the other end of the scale, you've got more data, and it's always going to be higher friction. We'll talk about progressive profiling and some of the ways that consumer identity management systems today gather that information in a way that's hopefully less intrusive than asking for it all up front. But really, I think the middle is where everybody will want to be, find out exactly the bits of information that you need. And yes, there will probably be just a little bit of friction for the user, but minimize it as best you can. So, going to go on the flip side here. Everybody touts the benefits of ride-hailing services, but just moving around Paris for the last few days, I started thinking, there are still some advantage to the old way of doing things. If you have a taxi, you want to get in a taxi, you don't necessarily need a phone. You don't need an app to get a ride. And when you get into the taxi, you don't have to create an account and set up yet another password. And, it's a pretty anonymous situation. They're not storing information about where you were or which friends were with you. When you look at the ride-hailing services, they require all of those things: a phone, an app, you've got to have an account, you need a password, and they're going to be stored in lots and lots of PII. And not to name names, but I think we all probably just read about last week, one of these ride-hailing services lost some user data. And there's always a need for security of the user data as well as privacy. So I thought I would just toss out a couple of generic rules to start, how we look at consumer identity management. So there is the ability to collect all kinds of information. You can start with advertising on Facebook. You can link that, get other information about where users have been, what their likes are, when they go to product pages. Of course, all of this is facilitated through the use of cookies, till you wind up, on the far end with, a company learning an awful lot about you that you may not have intended. So rule number one is don't be creepy. Use information, but make sure, again, you get the explicit consent for it. And if you don't need to track absolutely everything somebody does, then I think it would be a good idea not to, especially with GDPR coming up. Another one is don't annoy your consumers. I don't know about you all, but I certainly, whenever browsing the web, I find these pop-ups to be increasingly irritating, and I've tried every pop-up blocker I can get. But if I want to go learn about your product, I don't necessarily need a pop-up that shows up and asks me if I want to register for a webinar. Let me browse the site without being interrupted for a bit first. Or the chat box. Again, you're browsing on a site, just trying to get some information about a product. Maybe you want to read the technical details, and you'll get a chat box pop up. Do you want to talk to me about this? Well, maybe not right now. Or every retail website, it seems these days, when you go there and you wiggle your mouse around the screen just a little bit, they would like to add you to their mailing list. And again, I don't necessarily need to give you my email address just because I want to look at something on your site. So I guess the message would be just fine-tune how you want to interrupt a customer, how you can reduce friction, collect the information that you need for your marketing purposes, but do it in a way that it collects the consent of the person in a fair way.
And I think that there are some, also that might be a good place to collect a little bit of PII. So let's take the example of the Deutsche Bahn, the German railway. They have their ICE, on the ICE they have their Wi-Fi, and then you log in, you end up in a portal. And every time, after a couple of minutes, it pops up and says, do you want to participate in the survey? So if they would do that in a somewhat thoughtful way, they would, latest when I've 3 times removed that pop-up, they would store it somewhere and say, okay, obviously Martin Kuppinger, or at least that system, because it's always the same computer I'm using, the person using that computer is not heavily interested in answering that survey. But they pop it up again and again and again. And these are things which are really, where obviously the interest of collecting data is stands in stark contrast to the user experience. So I'm interested to learn about the delays they show up at the bottom of this portal. That's what I'm really interested in. But not all this pop-up stuff, etc. But I think behind all of or many of these things, there's a fundamental, I think we can call it mistake even, many organizations are making, and that is they're thinking too much inside out instead of thinking outside in. And I think this is what we really need to fundamentally change. So what do I mean by that? So when we have the enterprise and around it we have the consumers, then businesses tend, and also other organizations, governmental organizations, etc., they maybe even more sometimes, tend to think inside out. So what they do is, what works best for us? So what do we need as PII? Which authentication works for us? I recently had a conversation with someone who said, oh yeah, they ran a survey with a Swiss bank and the people weren't overly happy of having to use a Vasco OTP token for authentication to online banking. And then they added just an SMS out of band. So they did another thing which fit to their world instead of thinking what would be the customer's preferred way to do it. They didn't even raise that question, what does the customer really want? They just said, okay, he's not happy with that. We had another one, probably he's happy with that, but I didn't think it from the customer perspective, they thought it from the enterprise perspective. All the processes, etc., they are thought, in most cases, from inside out. So do what we want you to do. That's the perspective still most organizations take, at least implicitly. And I think what we really need to do is to look at it far more from a consumer perspective. So really think outside in, look at it from the different angle. So what works best for them? What do they accept as PII collected? Which type of authentication do they want to use? Oh, a lot of different ones, obviously. Everyone wants to use his smartphone, and when he uses a different device, he wants to use what works best on that device. That might vary even for the customer depending on the device he's using, but it's what we should support. So we do what you want to do. That must be the message to your consumer. We need to rethink that. And that's what I brought up is all these apps that are created. Everyone in the business tries to do the best from his small perspective on the customer. They don't start with a big view of what does our customer want to do? How can we do the best for him so that he does most with us? That's at the end, it's the question. And that will not work when we always look at it from an enterprise perspective. We need to take the perspective of the consumer first to be successful, particularly in this new age of GDPR, of PSD2 and a lot of other changes we are facing. With that, we are at the end of our first keynote. I think we have time left for one question before we move to the next keynote.